Everything begins in a very unusual way. The protagonist of the story wakes up in the middle of an alley, completely confused by the situation, and starts walking through the surrounding streets. When he reaches a very busy avenue, he wonders where exactly he is. The people around him, surprised, watch him closely as he passes by. Some whisper among themselves, questioning what a noble would be doing in a place like that and whether he might be acting incognito. The protagonist, for his part, realizes that he understands the language spoken there, but cannot fully grasp the context of their conversations. While a woman is buying fruit, he approaches without hesitation. The vendor and the customer turn toward him, visibly tense, but the protagonist simply greets them naturally and moves on, still confused. He comments to himself that he has never seen coins like those before. Moreover, even though the country seems vast, he cannot figure out where he is. After walking through the city for quite some time, he comes across people of all kinds. He notices a group wearing swords and armor, discussing a labyrinth. The protagonist assumes they are mercenaries, although he does not sense any clear signs that the country is on the verge of war. Curious to gather information, he decides to sell some of his belongings. At that moment, he spots a hunter's shop and decides to go inside. The shopkeeper greets him politely, but becomes nervous upon realizing he is dealing with a noble. The protagonist greets him and asks if he is open for business. The shopkeeper answers yes, though inwardly wondering why a noble would be in his shop. Suddenly, the protagonist says that he would like to sell something, and the shopkeeper replies that he will need to examine the item first. The protagonist then takes out his sword and places it on the counter, while he looks over the merchandise for sale. His eyes stop on a map that he does not recognize at all. As he examines it, he hears the shopkeeper praising the decoration of the sword, saying that its design is impressive and unlike anything he has ever seen. Realizing that he spoke too freely, the shopkeeper apologizes for his lack of manners. The protagonist reassures him, saying that he would not be offended by a simple compliment. He then asks how much the shopkeeper would offer for the sword. The shopkeeper replies that he can pay 200 gold coins. Without hesitation, the protagonist agrees, and a few seconds later a pile of coins appears on the table. He thanks him, but asks if there is something to store the coins in. The shopkeeper presents several types of coin pouches. Taking advantage of the moment, the protagonist also asks to buy the map hanging on the wall. The shopkeeper agrees, but first asks which pouch he prefers. The protagonist leaves the choice to him, which only makes the man even more nervous. After selecting the accessory, the shopkeeper explains how to store the coins. The protagonist is surprised when he sees it working. Even so, the shopkeeper adds that models with special enchantments are more expensive and have fewer options available. Upon hearing the word magic, the protagonist wonders whether it is very different from sorcery. Soon after, he is seen walking through the streets once again. He notices how similar the atmosphere of that place feels to the country he came from. However, that very similarity also makes him feel as though he does not belong there. Thinking once more about gathering information, he concludes that he needs to find someone willing to help him. Someone unafraid to speak their mind, with at least a decent sense of morality, and clever enough to read between the lines. While he is reflecting on this, a man stops him. The protagonist asks what he wants. The black-haired man simply warns him to avoid that alley. The protagonist thanks him, but as the man turns to leave, he tosses a coin in his direction. The man catches it easily and asks what he wants. The protagonist apologizes, introduces himself as Lisel, and says that he only wants to talk. As he speaks, he drops a few more coins, prompting the man to tell him to follow. They arrive at a bar, where the black-haired man asks the bartender to reserve a table in the back. On the way, Lisel greets the attendant, who also looks at him with curiosity. Once seated, a drink is brought to him. The man asks what Lisel wants to know, but before that, Lisel asks him to introduce himself, since simply exchanging information would be far too boring. He suggests talking about his profession, past relationships, or anything else, just so they can get to know each other better. With little choice, the man says his name is Gil, a lone, rank B adventurer. He has never had a girlfriend and has no intention of having one. He describes himself as a true lone wolf, cold and emotionally detached. Hearing this, Lisel concludes that the armed people he saw in the city are probably adventurers as well. Lisel remarks that even if Gil does not want a relationship, women must certainly not be lacking. Gil replies that Lisel can believe whatever he wants and takes it as a compliment. At that moment, Gil becomes more alert, curious to find out who Lisel really is. As the only rank B adventurer who works alone, he still does not feel intimidated by Lisel's presence. Gil does not know whether Lisel is truly powerful or merely a naive noble with no experience of the world. Lisel takes a sip of his drink and comments that Gil seems quite intelligent, asking if his impression is correct. Gil then asks whether Lisel intends to answer his questions as well. Lisel asks how far his curiosity goes, and Gil replies that he wants to know everything, including the details of Lisel's love life. Lisela begins by saying that he has no job and nothing to prove his status or position in society. As for his history with women, he comments that a true gentleman does not keep memories of such things. Gil does not feel that Lisela is lying, but he also feels that it was not exactly a friendly introduction, to which Lisela replies that it is because Gil did not ask the right questions. Gil tells himself that he does not intend to doubt him or dig deeper into his identity, although he admits to feeling some curiosity. At that point, Lisela suggests getting straight to the point, taking out a map and spreading it out on the table. To begin with, he asks Gil to explain the situation of the region shown on the map. Gil explains that they are in Parteda, the capital of the kingdom of Marcaday, a merchant nation. Cabana, on the other hand, is known as the land of magical minerals. He says that long ago Marcaday and Cabana had several skirmishes, but lately things have calmed down. To Lisel, it is obvious what the merchant nation is doing. Cabana must possess abundant natural resources and large mines. Thus, he asks what Gil thinks of Parteda, the capital. Gil finds the question far too vague and feels a bit lazy about answering. Even so, Lisela says that a brief opinion will be enough. Gil replies that there are good inns, tasty food, and that the jobs are not bad. Moreover, it is a comfortable place for adventurers. This leads Lisel to conclude that many people are constantly coming and going in the capital, which means that almost no one would stand out there. Next, Lisela says that at first he only intended to ask a few questions, but ends up asking for a favor. Gil comments that he agrees since the payment for the information was more than generous, and jokingly asks whether he wants him to be his guide, bodyguard, or simply an accompanying adventurer. Gil is only joking, but the shameless Lisel replies that he wants all of that at the same time. The black-haired man asks him to at least be more discreet, questioning whether that was really his goal. Lisel confirms it, but says that the final decision rests entirely with Gil. Gil sighs and asks how long he intends to hire him. Lisela replies that, for now, it will be just 1 month. During the first few days, Gil will stay with him and explain many things. After that, he will only accompany him when necessary. Gil, of course, has no intention of working for free and asks how much he will be paid for all of this. Lisel shows his negotiating side and asks how much effort Gil is willing to put in. Gil takes it lightly and agrees, asking who Lisel thinks he is talking to. With that, Lisela seals the deal by making his first request. After that, they rent a few rooms so that Lisel has a place to spend the night. Gil sits down and asks whether he will finally explain everything now. Lisel says yes, making it clear that everything he is about to say is absolutely true. Gil believes him. After all, Lisel has nothing to gain by lying. Lisel explains that he arrived in that kingdom knowing nothing, and that he comes from a place that simply does not exist there. He does not know whether everything happened by chance or if it was someone's doing. He remembers talking with a subordinate and suddenly appearing in an alley in that place. Since arriving, he has walked through many parts of the city, and everything is very similar to his homeland. This makes the situation even stranger, as if the world itself were off balance. He says he will speak based on that premise, and that if Gil does not believe him, he can simply leave him there. Gil asks him to continue. Lisela asks whether he believes his story, and the black-haired man replies that it would be far too stupid a lie. Then, dropping the jokes, he calls him Lord Aristocrat and asks him to introduce himself. With no alternative, Lisel reveals that he has just inherited his title, that he is in fact a duke, and that he holds the position of chancellor. Upon hearing this, Gil asks whether that means he is the king's right-hand man. Lisel confirms it, which surprises Gil, since he seems far too young. Lisel adds that his king was so extraordinary that he never made his age seem like an issue. Gil asks whether he cannot return to his own kingdom, and Lisel replies that he does not know. However, he is certain that if problems arise without him, they will find a way to bring him back. Faced with this, Gil asks why Lisel himself does not look for a solution. Lisel admits that it is tempting but prefers to leave it in his king's hands, since that is his specialty. Until then, he decides to treat everything as a vacation and enjoy it. The next day, he wakes up early and knocks on Gil's door. Gil asks whether he wants to go somewhere, and the protagonist replies that he wants to become an adventurer. At first, Gil doubts him, but when he realizes that Lisel is serious, he agrees to accompany him to buy equipment. After that, they head to the guild. Gil explains the basics. Adventurers take on jobs requested by third parties, and the guild acts as an intermediary. They then approach the receptionist, who informs them that the guild master is not present and asks them to return another day. Lisela clarifies that he came to register at the guild. The receptionist, named Stud, asks whether Single Sword did not explain anything. This confuses Lisel. The receptionist then explains that this is the black-haired man's nickname. Gil makes it clear that he did not choose that nickname himself, but setting that aside, the receptionist explains that the guild has the right to refuse government interference, and therefore does not accept registrations from nobles, knights, or the like, asking Lisel to leave. Gil says that is not what he thinks, because that guy is not a noble. The receptionist does not believe him, but Gil insists. With no further objections, the receptionist agrees to proceed. With everything ready, the man introduces himself as Stud, and asks the protagonist to prick his finger with an object. Lisel obeys and sees a drop of blood fall onto a sheet, causing it to begin glowing. After that, he thinks about licking his finger, but Gil immediately stops him and scolds him for being so careless. With everything completed, Stud hands him the guild card and then takes out some books to explain how job requests work. He mentions that the guild provides encyclopedias with information about monsters and plants that may be requested in missions. If any doubts arise, they can be consulted or asked directly at the reception desk. Lisel asks whether these encyclopedias are for sale. Stud replies that they are not, but that they can be consulted for free. He also warns that it is strictly forbidden to remove any book from the guild building. With that said, he takes a small piece of paper and draws a map indicating a bookstore that sells books of all types and specialties. Lisel thanks him and, as a gesture of gratitude, pats his head before leaving. Everyone in the guild is shocked, wondering whether he really just patted the head of the absolute zero. Stud touches his own head, confused, wondering what just happened. 3 days later, we see Lisel reading peacefully. At that moment, Gil knocks on the door and enters the room. Lisel greets him and asks how things went with what he had requested. The black-haired man replies that everything went well and asks whether Lisel does not get tired of reading so much. Gil then picks up a book and reads the first paragraph he finds. Lisel continues the narrative from memory, making it clear that he has already read all those books, and asks whether the reading was enjoyable. Gil comments that, to him, it sounded more like complete nonsense. They then close the books. Lisel notes that it is almost lunchtime, so he suggests they go eat and then stop by the guild afterward. Gil asks whether he finally intends to accept a job, and Lisel confirms it. When they arrive, Lisel greets Stud, who obviously remembers him. After all, how could he forget the noble who patted his head? Lisel sits down and says that he returned to hear the rest of the explanations about how to accept missions. At that moment, another adventurer speaks loudly, giving Gil a strange look, commenting that Single Sword had really fallen off since he wanted to see who had joined the famous adventurer and ended up finding only a delicate young man who looked like a noble. Both Gil and Lisel ignore him, while Stud hands Lisel a list of guild rules. The adventurer continues complaining to Gil, saying that he refused his invitation to team up with a rookie and asking what was going through his head. Gil simply looks at him with disdain and asks who he thinks he is. This obviously irritates the adventurer. Gil makes it clear that he should not talk to him since he does not know him and they are not friends. At that point, the adventurer makes an indecent remark, insinuating whether Lisel was worth it. Coldly, Gil replies that at least Lisel is better than him. Stud and Lisel hear this. Lisel comments that Gil's contract was for 1 month, but that it might be better to end everything right there. Stud also calls the adventurer indecent. Even so, for Lisel, it is a problem that people speak ill of Gil. The adventurer asks what was said. Lisel stands up from his chair, faces him directly, and explains that he and Gil joined forces because they made an agreement. The adventurer calls him arrogant for having bought Single Sword, and now thinking himself important. Lisel asks whether he really believes that Gil would sell himself for a few coins. If that were the case, he challenges him to pay more than he is paying right now, though he doubts he could manage it. This enrages the adventurer, who boasts that he is also a rank B adventurer, just like Gil. Hearing that, Lisel congratulates him. The adventurer starts laughing, thinking he has won the argument. However, Lisel feels deeply irritated that someone of that caliber would dare compare himself to something that, to him, belongs to him, referring to Gil. This causes the adventurer to lose control, draw his sword, and hurl insults. He immediately charges to attack. Stud stands up, but Gil steps forward, blocks the strike, and snaps the opponent's sword in half. The adventurer is left speechless. Then Gil twists his body and delivers a powerful kick, sending him flying into the wall. At that moment, Lisel looks at Stud and realizes that he is about to use magic. Grabbing his wrist, Lisel stops him, reminding him that guild staff cannot get involved in fights between adventurers. Stud cancels the spell and explains that he can only intervene if requested as an arbitrator, though that is not prohibited. Lisel understands and says he was worried about a possible punishment. He then hands over money to cover the repairs to the wall and asks to leave the matter of work for another day, leaving the guild. Back in their rooms, Gil drinks a glass of liquor. He recalls how his body moved on instinct, protecting Lisel without even thinking. He also remembers the adventurer's words about comparing ranks, but above all, the fact that Lisel said he belongs to him. At that, Gil simply laughs, saying that it is not as if he were his knight. In the end, if you made it this far, comment the word world to show that you followed until the end. On a new day, we see everyone having breakfast. Lisel compliments the good taste of the food, something Gil doesn't really believe. Suddenly, the captain of the knights bursts into the place asking about a man who is pretending to be a noble and is staying there. The owner of the place gets irritated and asks him not to accuse her customers of such strange things, but the captain insists and requests permission to check if the information is true. At that moment, he sees our protagonist having tea. He freezes and, mistaking him for a noble, apologizes for his rudeness. Lisel reassures him and clarifies that he is not a noble, but rather an adventurer. The captain asks her not to believe that and tells him not to lie. After that, Lisel and Gil go for a walk in the forest, starting another day as adventurers. Our protagonist comments that he hopes to learn a lot from him once again. Gil asks him to stop talking like that, because if he keeps it up, he won't pass for an adventurer. Lizel understands and then asks him to teach him many things. Gil comments that that doesn't suit him either. Changing the subject, he points in a direction where there's a rat. Lizel is surprised both by the life in that world and by the enormous size of the rat. Gil explains that it's a prairie rat, a monster. If they kill 10 that day, they'll complete the mission, but since they're very fast, caution is needed. Our protagonist doesn't even hear this last part and, summoning a magical weapon, takes out the rat. Gil asks if he can't go a single minute without scaring people. Lizel apologizes and asks if he was startled. Gil replies that anyone would be surprised if something like that suddenly appeared and fired. Lizel asks if, in that world, pistols fire lead bullets. Gil confirms and mentions that they're very difficult to use. In response, Lizel comments that his is different as he puts the pistol to his own head. Gil quickly puts his hand out, but no harm occurs when the shot goes off. Lizel explains that the bullets from that pistol aren't made of lead, but are magical. He demonstrates this by defeating 2 more rats, and so they continue with the mission. At the end, they return to the guild and choose another mission. They see one that involves collecting items up to the 5th level of the labyrinth for a certain labyrinth collector, requiring an appraisal certificate, with a base reward of 10 silver coins. The guild attendant comments that their rank is appropriate to reach the 5th level, and that under these conditions, the reward is good. So Lizel decides to accept it. He goes to Stud and sits down, showing him the mission. While the black-haired young man registers the request, he asks if Lizel has any questions. Lizel asks if really any object will do. Stud confirms, explaining that as long as it's something found only in the labyrinth, anything is valid. This seems perfect for Lizel. Then he asks what the others are doing there. Stud reveals that they found a new labyrinth a few days ago, and that they plan to go through it, but it's been very difficult since lately they've been spending hours just trying. Gil asks what good it does to just sit there staring at the table in silence. Stud clarifies that the difficulty isn't the monsters, but rather the puzzles, because they say the place is full of very complex riddles and they want to solve them as soon as possible. Gil understands that they're after the bonus for completing the labyrinth. Lizel asks what that means. Then Gil explains that it's a reward the labyrinth gives only to the first group that manages to complete it. Stud adds that being one of the first to do this also affects your rank. Currently, there are hardly any adventurers accepting jobs. He tells our protagonist that, if he's interested, he could take a look at those tables, since that's where the first cryptogram appears. Lizel asks Gil's opinion, but he says not to even think about it, because their fate is already decided. So, with the registration done, they were about to leave, but Lizel gets curious and asks for a moment to take a look. In this way, he approaches a blonde young man and, upon reading his notes, whispers that those are numbers from a very ancient language and that they are very well organized. After saying that, he walks away. The young man is left confused. His companions ask if he had any information stolen. The blonde replies that no, on the contrary. Next, we see our protagonist walking through the forest. Lizel can't stop thinking about those ancient letters, because he knows them very well. Intrigued, he wonders if that world is the past or the present of his own. After a few minutes, they arrive at the labyrinth. Gil opens the door and they both enter. Inside, Lizel walks calmly in search of the items. Gil comments that everything is completely random and that all they can do is keep walking. Lizel asks if there is a boss on the deepest level. Gil confirms, but makes it clear that it's not very strong. Suddenly, an arrow is fired. Immediately, Gil protects our protagonist. He asks why Gil thinks the mechanism was triggered by him. Gil replies that he doesn't know, but even so, he should be more careful when walking through that place. As they go down some stairs, they reach a room with 2 chests. Gil comments that they were very lucky to have them appear already on the 2nd level. Our protagonist opens the chests and finds something unusual. They go to the appraiser from the beginning, hand over 2 stuffed animals, and ask for his opinion on what price he would put on the items. He hesitates and ends up saying they're not worth much, but that he could buy them. Lizel replies no, thanks him, and only asks for a certificate proving their value as labyrinth items. Thinking about how he should deliver them, he comes up with the idea of wrapping them in gift paper with a ribbon. So, at night, we see the gifts at the guild's reception, with Stud taking care of them in his room. Lizel comments to Gil about the guys from the morning, the ones he helped with the cryptogram, while they were talking about it. At that moment, the very same guys show up in front of the inn. Now we see them gathered together. The leader of the group introduces himself as Egg, and asks our protagonist for help to advance to the next stage of the labyrinth. Lizel demands 50% of the total reward, something the other considers absurd. Faced with this, our protagonist points out that he gets nothing if he just helps them. He makes it clear that if they want, he can go to the labyrinth himself the next day. Upon hearing this, Aang gets upset and ends up agreeing to pay half. The next day, while our protagonist was sleeping, Aang and his group enter his room with Gil's permission. Liesel asks for the note and, after reading everything, asks him to come closer. Still half asleep, he explains what needs to be done. The blonde guy starts taking notes frantically, but the protagonist ends up falling asleep in the middle of the explanation. Later, Liesel and Gil meet at the guild, looking over the available jobs. Liesel notices that so far, no one has requested bodyguards. Gil comments that it's not even worth bothering, since you need to be rank C to accept that kind of mission. At that moment, Stud shows up asking for a moment with our protagonist. He explains that the person who requested the job the other day came to the guild and wants to meet him, because he was so satisfied with the result that he wants to thank him in person. So, our protagonists accompany him and wait in a private room. Suddenly, a well-dressed blonde man enters the room. Upon seeing our protagonist, he thinks there must have been a mistake, but Stud corrects him. Our protagonist greets him and introduces himself as the person who accepted his request. The man is surprised, saying he has never seen an adventurer like him before. He invites him to sit down and introduces himself as Ray, a viscount and commander of the military police. Getting straight to the point, he tells our protagonist that he is deeply grateful for giving him the opportunity to see such well-wrapped objects. After having a bit of tea, he leaves a gold coin on the table and asks him to accept it as payment for the excitement he felt. Liesel also drinks the tea and, placing his cup on top of the coin, says that he accepts the extra payment. Ray observes this, and standing up extends his hand, saying that he hopes they can get along. Liesel thanks him, but comments that this is too much for an F-rank adventurer. Ray clarifies that he doesn't mean it that way. Touching his own chest, he says that he just wants to be his friend on a personal level. Faced with this, Liesel accepts. We then notice that the blonde reveals a strange look. He tells our protagonist that he would like to invite him to his house someday to show him his collection. Without further ado, he says goodbye. Alone, Liesel comments to Gil that, with that, it seems he has gotten rid of the suspicions they had about him. Gil asks how he can be so sure. Liesel points to his own chest and says that he examined him before he left. The scene shifts to Ray, who, looking at his own hand, comments that our protagonist didn't change at all and apparently didn't feel even a hint of fear, something he considers perfect for starting to build a friendship. At night, Liesel and Gil are drinking together. The protagonist comments that Ayn and his group managed to be the first to complete the labyrinth and that he benefited from it. He asks Gil if that amount is considered a lot. Gil replies that it would only be enough to buy equipment of a rank higher than his own. Then, Liesel asks why Gil is a rank B. Gil answers that he likes to work alone. However, Liesel doesn't completely believe him. Gil then comments that A-rank adventurers or higher usually have a lot of contact with nobles, which means having to behave according to their standards, something he finds extremely irritating. Liesel understands. Then, watching him drink his wine, Liesel hands him his monthly payment, plus an extra amount as a reserve, saying that he would like Gil to help him the next time he needs something. As he does this, he is about to drink his own beverage, but Gil causes it to spill. Liesel asks him to let go. Since he isn't obeyed, he asks again politely, saying he doesn't want to have to order anything. He clarifies that he doesn't want to tie him down, but as he says this, Gil grabs him by the clothes and makes it clear that this was his own decision because it's what he wants, so Liesel has no reason to interfere. After clarifying this, he sits down and returns the money, asking only one thing in return, that Liesel doesn't bother him. Liesel smiles and promises to do his best to live up to him. Well, if you've made it this far, comment the word silver, so I know you watched until the end.